Some betrayals hit you like a bullet. Fast, brutal, final. Others creep in slow, like rust on a rifle, eating away at everything solid until it crumbles in your hands. My name is Alan Hewitt. I'm 58 years old, a former Marine, and now run my own security consulting firm. Grew up on a farm in Texas where my old man taught me the value of work before I was tall enough to lift a bale of hay. Spent my 20s in the Corps, my 30s and 40s building a life. My wife, Karen, was the best thing I ever had, and losing her damn near took me under. But a man either gets back up or stays down. I got up. These days, I keep busy making sure people with too much money and too little sense don't get themselves killed. That's about as much purpose as I need. I live outside Austin, where the land still has some air in it. The house is quiet, sturdy, functional. No clutter, no wasted space. Mornings start the same: black coffee, a run before sunrise, then weights in the barn I turned into a gym. I keep the rust off my body the same way I do my weapons, regular maintenance. Ain't got time to fall apart. Elaine, my wife, second wife, technically was a different breed. Blonde, sharp-dressed, always polished. We met at a security conference where she was consulting on risk management. Smart, ambitious, not the type to back down. I liked that about her. Thought maybe she liked the steadiness in me. We built a good life, or so I figured. But lately, things had started shifting in that slow, quiet way you don't notice until you're standing in the middle of the wreckage. She picked up a new hobby a few months back, some kind of physical therapy for stress relief. I didn't think much of it. We live in a city full of people trying to find balance or reconnect with themselves. Seemed harmless. But then there were the late meetings, the extra hours at the office, the way her phone never left her hand. Little things. Small shifts. A woman's habits are like the wind, change direction just a little and you know a storm's coming. Heading out again? I asked one evening as she grabbed her bag. She barely looked up. Late client call. Might run over. I nodded. No argument, no suspicion in my voice. Want me to set a plate aside? I'll grab something on the way. A small pause, almost nothing, but enough for me to catch the way she didn't quite meet my eye. I let it slide. Just noted it. Like marking coordinates on a map. The cracks widened when I heard it from someone else. Roderick, my son, was in town for a few days and we decided to hit up an old haunt near the river for a beer. Over fried catfish and cold Shinerbach, we shot the breeze about work, about the new kid he was mentoring in his law firm, about nothing and everything. Then he glanced up. Ran into something odd yesterday, he said, scratching at his jaw. Took a tour downtown with some out-of-towners. Guide was one of those history nuts, loved to talk. Guy went on, and somewhere in the mix, he mentioned seeing Mom on a tour a couple weeks back. Said she was with some tall, friendly guy. Seemed to think it was you. I took a slow drink, let the words settle. That right? Yeah. Just thought it was weird, since I didn't think you did the tourist thing. I set my beer down, wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. I don't. Roderick knew better than to push. He let it drop, but I caught the way he studied me out of the corner of his eye. He had his mother's sharp instincts. Always picking up signals. That night I didn't say a damn thing to Elaine. Didn't ask, didn't accuse. A man who's spent years dealing with threats knows better than to charge into a situation blind. Instead, I started watching. Just quiet observation. Paying attention to things I'd let slide before. Her phone was always face down now. Calls taken in another room. I logged the times, the places, the changes in habit. When you strip emotion from a situation, all that's left is facts, and facts don't lie. A week later, I had enough of them. I never moved on instinct alone. You don't last long in my line of work if you do. A man who reacts without thinking is a man who gets caught off guard. So I gathered my intel the way I always did, quiet, methodical, precise. Elaine's new routine had patterns. Late meetings on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Always running behind after work. The gym bag in her trunk but no sweat on her shirt when she got home. And then there was the name that popped up more than once, Everett Lockwood. Didn't take long to find out who he was. Physical therapist. Mid-40s. One of those soft-spoken types, the kind that listens a little too well. Owned a clinic in South Austin, catered to professionals with stress injuries. Seemed to think of himself as a healer. I'd seen his kind before. The ones who get too close, play the understanding man, let vulnerable people mistake attention for something deeper. One evening, I called an old contact, Reese, a PI I'd worked with a few times when corporate clients needed dirt on problem employees. Got a name for you? I said as I sat on my back porch, a glass of whiskey in one hand. Everett Lockwood. Runs a PT clinic. Needs schedules, habits, financials, whatever you can pull. Reese snorted. That the guy stepping on your toes? I took a slow sip. Something like that. Give me a couple days. I already knew what he'd find. That weekend, Elaine mentioned a work retreat at a hotel in San Antonio. She said it without meeting my eye, stirring her coffee like it was the most natural thing in the world. You gonna be back Sunday? I asked casual. She hesitated just a fraction too long. Might stay until Monday morning. We've got a networking event late Sunday night. I nodded. Let the silence stretch. You want me to drive you? I asked. She laughed a little too quick. No. I'll carpool with some colleagues. There was no carpool. She took her own car. I knew because I followed her. By the time she pulled into the Weston Riverwalk, I was already in a seat at the hotel bar, dressed like another corporate traveler, reading the San Antonio Express news like I gave a damn about the local politics. She walked in through the side entrance, not the front. Small detail, but an important one. People hiding something take the quiet way in. 10 minutes later, Everett walked in. Dressed down. Jeans, a polo, sleeves rolled up like he wanted to show off his forearms. He scanned the room like a man who thought he was being careful but wasn't careful enough. He didn't even pause before heading toward the elevators. I waited, watched, and when Elaine followed him up 15 minutes later, I set my paper down and left. That was all I needed. Back home, Reese had already sent me a file. Financials, addresses, even an old business partner Everett had screwed over years ago. No legal trouble, but the guy had a habit of skating on the edge. Insurance claims that didn't quite add up, a history of getting a little too close to female clients. Nothing solid, just enough smoke to tell me where the fire was. Now came the hard part. The waiting. 2 nights later, Elaine came home late again. She set her bag down, kicked off her heels. I was at the kitchen counter, wiping down my SIG. You eat? I asked, keeping my voice easy. She nodded, stretching her neck like she was exhausted. Yeah. Grabbed something with the team. I glanced at her, not too long. You work with Lockwood a lot? The way she froze, just for a second, was all the answer I needed. She recovered fast, shrugging. Some. He's been helping me with my shoulder. Why? I set the SIG down, wiping the barrel slow. Just wondering if he's any good. Might be needing a PT myself. She licked her lips, forcing a smile. I don't know if he takes male clients. He mostly works with... She stopped herself, realizing too late what she'd just admitted. I didn't move, didn't say a damn thing. Just let it sit between us like the loaded gun on the table. After a long moment, she muttered something about taking a shower and walked off. That night I didn't sleep, didn't toss and turn either. Just stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of it settle. By morning I had a plan. I went about my routine like nothing had changed. Coffee, run, quick workout, business calls. Discipline is what keeps a man from going under when the world around him starts cracking. Elaine moved through the house like she could feel the shift but didn't know why. She wasn't stupid. She knew something was off, but she wasn't sure if it was me or the weight of her own guilt pressing down. That's the thing about cheaters, they think they're the ones holding the cards, but the moment you see through them, the game's already over. I started planting seeds. One evening, I brought up a former colleague from my military days who got caught sleeping with a subordinate's wife. Nothing obvious, just a casual story over dinner. He lost everything, I said, spearing a piece of steak with my fork. Job, pension. His name was worth dirt after that. Elaine pushed her food around on her plate. That's awful. I shrugged. Should have thought about that before he screwed over someone who trusted him. She didn't have much appetite after that. A few days later, I set up surveillance on Everett's clinic. Nothing fancy, just enough to track his movements. Reese had dug into his client list, finances, and records. A few whispers about insurance fraud. Some shady business deals. And one pissed-off ex-employee who was more than happy to tell me about under-the-table cash deals that didn't sit right with the books. You want this going public? Reese asked when he passed me the details over a beer. Not yet, I said. I want him to feel it first. Elaine kept acting normal. A little too normal. smiling more, asking about my day as if overcompensating would make the truth go away. I played along, pretending to buy the act. Meanwhile, I collected proof. Security footage from restaurants, transaction records, hotel logs. I didn't need to catch them in the act, I just needed to build the case. One night, I came home earlier than usual. Elaine was in the kitchen, phone in her hand. When I walked in, she locked it fast. Long day? I asked, setting my keys on the counter. She nodded. Exhausting. I leaned against the counter, watching her. You still seeing Lockwood for those sessions? She blinked, hesitated just long enough for me to see it. Yeah, now and then. I nodded real slow. Good. Might schedule a session myself. See what he's about. Her face didn't change, but her hand gripped the counter a little tighter. That night, she barely said a word. The next morning, Reese called me. Got something interesting, he said. Lockwood's clinic might be in some deep shit. Feds flagged a couple of his insurance claims, looks like he's been double billing clients. And one of his former patients? Filed a complaint about inappropriate conduct. I smiled to myself. Timing's everything. It was time to squeeze. I waited. The best way to break a man isn't to hit him hard, it's to let him feel the walls closing in, inch by inch, until he suffocates. Elaine's routine shifted again. She was more careful now. Checked her phone in another room. Left earlier, came home later. But she wasn't careful enough. One evening I pulled into a parking lot across from Everett's clinic. Sat there in my truck, sipping black coffee, watching. 10 minutes before closing, Elaine's car pulled up. She didn't park out front like a regular client. She went around the back. I checked my watch. 6:47 p.m. I gave it 10 minutes, then climbed out. Walked across the lot, taking my time. The front desk girl was locking up when I knocked. Sorry, we're closed, she said. I nodded. I'm looking for Everett Lockwood. He in? She hesitated. He's finishing up with a patient. I let that hang in the air. That right? She shifted her weight, uncomfortable. I glanced past her, down the dim hallway. The door to the therapy rooms was shut. I looked back at her, gave an easy smile. I'll wait. She opened her mouth to argue, then thought better of it. I took a seat in the small waiting area, leaned back, crossed my arms. 5 minutes later, the door down the hall creaked open. Elaine stepped out first. Hair a little tousled. Everett followed, pulling his shirt sleeves back down. Elaine stopped cold when she saw me. I stood up slow. Everett frowned, glancing between us. Alan, right? His voice had that fake professional warmth, like he was used to diffusing tension with friendly tones. I didn't answer. Just looked at Elaine. She swallowed hard. Alan, what are you doing here? Thought I'd drop in, I said. Since you've been spending so much time here. Everett shifted, clearing his throat. Listen, I think maybe. I cut my eyes toward him. He shut up. Elaine tried to recover. Alan, it's not a. I held up a hand. Don't. Her lips pressed together. I looked at Everett again, slow and deliberate. You run a business here, right? A real, legitimate one. His throat bobbed. Of course. I nodded. Funny. 'Cause I hear there's been some insurance issues. Couple of complaints. Might be worth looking into. His face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about. I let the silence stretch. Let him feel it. Elaine glanced between us, suddenly panicked. Alan, let's go. Please. I looked at her. That's the first honest thing you've said all night. Then I turned and walked out. Didn't slam the door. Didn't raise my voice. Just left. Back home, I poured a drink, sat out on the porch and listened to the night. Stars overhead, cicadas humming. The sound of something ending. Elaine came home an hour later. I heard her hesitate in the doorway. I didn't turn around. Just took a sip of whiskey. You gonna lie, I said, or are you finally gonna tell me the truth? Silence. Then a slow breath. As she stopped, voice shaking. It wasn't supposed to happen. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Yeah. It never is. She moved closer. Alan, I held up a hand. Don't. Just don't. Another long silence. Then she whispered, what now? I drained the last of my drink. Now? I stood up, looked her dead in the eye. Now you get to live with what you did. Then I walked inside, locked the door behind me and let the house go silent. Elaine moved out a week later. No big scene, no screaming, no tears. Just quiet. She packed her things while I was at work, left her key on the counter. That was fine by me. I didn't need to watch her go. Divorce papers were already in motion. My lawyer was a guy I trusted, an ex-Marine like me, the kind who didn't waste words or time. We met at his office downtown. A no-nonsense place with leather chairs and thick, quiet walls. She know what's coming? He asked, flipping through the paperwork. She does now. He nodded. You'll get the house, most of the assets. No alimony. She won't fight. I leaned back in my chair. She's got no ground to stand on. Good. Let's make it quick. That was the plan. I didn't want drawn-out battles or petty back and forth. I wanted her gone, clean and final. Elaine wasn't dumb. She knew better than to try to drag this out. The last real conversation we had was 3 days after she left. She called late. I almost ignored it, but something made me pick up. A long pause on the line. Then, Alan. I didn't say anything. She exhaled. I never meant for it to. Don't. Silence. Then softer. Are you ever gonna forgive me? I stared at the darkened TV screen across the room. I don't waste time on things that don't matter anymore. Another pause. Then a quiet, goodbye, Alan. She hung up first. That was fine by me. In the meantime, I tightened the noose on Everett. Word about his business practices had started circulating. Calls were being made, complaints reviewed. The Texas Medical Board had taken an interest, and once those bureaucrats sink their teeth in, they don't let go. Reese kept me updated. He's sweating. He told me over a beer one evening. Got a few of his female clients canceling appointments. One of them dropped his name in a harassment complaint. You want me to push harder? I shook my head. No need. He'll sink on his own. And he did. A week later, an article popped up in the local news. Prominent Austin physical therapist under investigation for insurance fraud. I read it over coffee, taking my time. No mention of Elaine. That was fine. She'd feel it anyway. Elaine, from what I heard, wasn't doing so well. The whispers started small. Mutual friends pulling back. Invitations drying up. People like her, who lived in polished social circles, didn't recover from public disgrace easily. The woman who once held her head high at corporate fundraisers now walked into rooms where conversations stopped when she entered. Roderick called one evening. She reached out, he said, voice tight. I waited. She wanted to explain. He let out a breath. I told her I wasn't interested. I nodded, though he couldn't see it. You okay? He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, just pissed off. I got that. He loved his mother, but he respected loyalty more. He'd seen what she did, and he wasn't the type to forget. Come by for a drink, I said. He did, and we didn't talk about her again. The papers went through without a hitch. Clean. Fast. By the time the ink dried, Elaine was just a name on a document. She got what little she was owed. Nothing more. No drawn-out fights. No late-night calls begging for another chance. She knew better. Everett wasn't so lucky. His clinic took a hit, patients dropping off after the article made the rounds. The fraud investigation didn't go away, and by the time the state board started reviewing his records, his days of running a business were numbered. I never reached out to him, never said a word. A man like him, he'd know exactly why his life was falling apart. One evening, Reese sent me a photo. Everett sitting alone outside a rundown cafe, looking like a man who just realized he bet everything on the wrong hand. I stared at it for a moment, then deleted it. He wasn't worth my time anymore. Roderick came by that weekend. Brought a six-pack, let himself in like always. We sat on the back porch, the Texas heat settling in around us, cicadas humming in the trees. You hear about Lockwood? He asked, popping the cap off a bottle. I nodded. Saw the article. Roderick took a slow pull of his beer. One of my clients knows him. Says he's selling the clinic. Trying to move. I just sipped my drink. Good. Roderick studied me for a second. You gonna tell me how much of that was you? I looked at him, let a beat pass. Does it matter? He smirked, shook his head. Guess not. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sky fade from orange to deep blue. You ever gonna get back out there? He asked eventually. I knew what he meant. Dating. Women. That whole mess. I let out a slow breath. Not in a hurry. Roderick nodded. Probably smart. We left it at that. A few weeks later, I got a call from an old buddy in Montana. Guy owned a few hundred acres out in the valley. Said he was thinking about selling a piece of it. Wanted to know if I was interested. I drove up that weekend. Stood on the ridge, looking out over miles of open land. Mountains stretching in the distance. Quiet. Clean air. No ghosts, no baggage. By the end of the day, the deal was done. The house sold fast. Elaine reached out once. A short, polite message. Heard you're moving. Hope you're well. I didn't respond. Packing was easy. Never owned more than I needed. By the time I loaded up the truck and pulled onto the highway, Austin was already behind me. Some men let betrayal define them. Me? I let it sharpen the blade. Montana suited me. Wide open land, crisp air, a silence that let a man think. The property had a solid cabin, nothing fancy, just space, peace, and a back porch that looked out over miles of valley. I kept busy, built a workshop, spent mornings working with my hands, afternoons hiking the ridges. Kept myself sharp. Roderick came up for a visit 6 months after I settled in. He stepped out of his rental, took one look at the land, and let out a low whistle. Damn, Dad. Thought you were going off the grid, but this is next level. I shook his hand, clapped him on the back. Figured it was time for a change. He set his bag down on the porch, taking in the view. Can't say I blame you. We grilled steaks that night, sat outside with a couple of cold beers. He caught me up on work, his latest cases, a woman he'd been seeing but wasn't sure about yet. I listened. He was smart, like his mother, but he'd picked up my instincts. Knew when people were full of shit. At some point, he leaned back in his chair, watching the fire die down. Ever hear from her? I didn't need to ask who he meant. Not since that last message. He nodded, seemed satisfied with that. Probably for the best. Yeah. Another long silence, then he smirked. Lockwood's done, by the way. Lost his clinic. No one else would hire him. I took a slow sip of my beer. No kidding. Roderick chuckled. Thought you'd like to know. I just nodded. I already knew. A week after the sale went through, an anonymous tip landed in the inbox of the state attorney general's office. A neat package of financial discrepancies, past complaints, and a few too many insurance irregularities to ignore. I wasn't surprised when his license got pulled. Couldn't run a clinic if he couldn't practice. Couldn't move to another state if he had a permanent black mark on his record. He'd been forced to sell his house, leave town, start over with nothing. Elaine? She didn't bounce back. The world she built for herself, the carefully curated social circle, the career, the reputation collapsed the moment people saw her for what she was. She didn't just lose friends, she lost standing. The kind of people she surrounded herself with didn't forgive weakness, and she'd made herself weak the moment she got caught. I'd heard she was living in a condo now, nothing like the home she left. The big career moves dried up, her influence shrank. She'd lost her place at the table, and once you fall from a certain height, there's no climbing back. I didn't waste time thinking about it. One evening, after Roderick had flown back to Texas, I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the mountains. The air smelled clean, crisp, untouched. No baggage, no ghosts, just the land stretching out like it had been waiting for me all along. Some men let betrayal break them. Some let it eat them alive. Me? I let it fuel me. Rebuild stronger. Smarter. Harder. I tipped my drink back, let the cold burn settle in my chest, and smiled. I didn't just win. I erased them.